Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. And today we're going to be exploring a case that I think you're going to find pretty fascinating. The case of Keith Hunter Jesperson.
The happy face killer.
That's right, the happy face killer. We've got some excerpts here focusing on his crimes, his background, the psychology, family impact, and how this story has been portrayed in media. So really kind of hitting it from all sides. And the big question here that we're tackling is, how does a seemingly ordinary truck driver become a serial killer who taunts the police with smiley face confessions?
It's a question that continues to fascinate and frighten us. And the answers, as we dig into the research, they're not always clear-cut. Sometimes we find those threads connecting childhood to horrific acts, but sometimes it's a little more difficult to find those connections.
Yeah. Well, let's start untangling some of those threads. We know that Jesperson was born in 1955 in Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada. Seemingly an average start, but the excerpts you provided hint at some cracks in that facade pretty early on.
Right from the get-go, we see some red flags in his childhood. One of the articles mentions Jesperson's father being an abusive alcoholic. Sadly, this is a common thread that we see in the backgrounds of many violent offenders. This type of upbringing can create what psychologists call attachment trauma.
Okay, so even though Jesperson wasn't the direct target of his father's alcoholism, the atmosphere at home was still pretty toxic.
Exactly. It created an unstable and insecure environment.
So he's already at a disadvantage, emotionally speaking.
Right. And on top of that, he was a large kid, so he was often ostracized by his peers. Social isolation, plus an unstable home life. That's a recipe for brewing resentment and anger.
And it sounds like those feelings found an outlet in a really disturbing way. One of the things that was mentioned in the research is that Jesperson tortured and killed animals when he was a child. That's pretty chilling.
It's definitely disturbing behavior. And from a psychological perspective, it's a lot more than just kids being cruel. We're talking about control. A child who feels powerless in their own life might try to exert power over a creature that can't fight back. This is also where we see the desensitization to suffering. That lack of empathy that's so crucial to healthy development.
Yeah, and sadly, this early behavior is often a foreshadowing of much darker things to come. But let's jump ahead to 1990. This is when his killing spree begins. It lasts for 5 years. He murders at least 8 women across several states. And one of the things that really stands out is his modus operandi. He used strangulation. Why strangulation?
Well, like the animal torture, strangulation's about control. It allows the perpetrator to literally squeeze the life out of the victim, silencing their voice, their struggle.
So there's a sense of power in that, dominance, maybe something that was lacking in his own life?
It's definitely possible.
Yeah.
And there's another theory I want to mention. Some experts believe that strangulation can provide a distorted sense of intimacy for the perpetrator.
A distorted sense of intimacy?
Yeah. Think about it. Jesperson was starved for connection, for positive touch throughout his childhood. So as horrifying as it sounds, strangulation might have provided this twisted, fleeting sense of closeness that he craved.
Wow, that's disturbing, but it makes sense in a way. It's like his early traumas are playing out in these horrific acts. So after his first murder, things take a turn. He doesn't just disappear. He wants the spotlight.
This is where those infamous happy face letters come in. We've all seen those creepy smiley faces plastered across documentaries and news articles. But the psychology behind them is really fascinating.
Yeah, let's get into that.
Yeah.
So he starts sending these detailed confessions to the media, to law enforcement. Why?
He was crying out for recognition. It was a desperate attempt to control the narrative. Remember, as a child, he felt powerless, ignored, pushed to the margins. Now he's the center of a nationwide manhunt. He's calling the shots, dictating how his story unfolds.
So he's playing a game with the authorities, and those smiley faces are his signature move.
Right. Taunting, shocking, cementing his place in the public consciousness.
But the game changes in 1995. Jesperson murders his girlfriend Julie Winningham, and this time the mask slips.
This is what leads to his capture. The investigation into Julie's death exposes those cracks in his facade. He gets apprehended, and eventually those confessions that he was so eager to send, they start flowing. He admits to multiple murders. The happy-faced killer finally has a name and a face.
Justice is served. He gets sentenced to life without parole. But the story doesn't end there. We have to consider the victims, their families, the communities left shattered by his actions.
Absolutely. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into the aftermath. We'll explore the lasting impact on those whose lives were forever intertwined with Keith Hunter Jesperson. And we'll also consider his daughter's perspective, a woman forced to reconcile the love for her father with the monster he became.
It's really heavy stuff when we start looking closer at the victims. One of the excerpts mentioned that Jesperson primarily targeted vulnerable women, often sex workers or women experiencing homelessness. It's just a chilling reminder of how certain groups are more vulnerable to predators.
Absolutely, it's a heartbreaking reality. These women were already facing so many challenges, just trying to survive. And tragically, their circumstances made them easier targets.
Yeah. The research also highlighted a pattern in the locations where the bodies were found, often along highways or in remote areas.
Right, that speaks volumes about his attempts to conceal his crimes,
Yeah.
the calculated nature of his actions.
It wasn't a crime of passion, it was methodical.
Exactly.
And speaking of calculated, those happy face letters, they've become almost as infamous as the crimes themselves. What do you think drove him to send those?
It's a complex question.
Yeah.
But I think we need to consider the cultural landscape of the time. Remember, this was the early 90s. Serial killers were captivating the public imagination. Figures like Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer had achieved this disturbing kind of celebrity.
So Jesperson wanted that same notoriety.
I think so. He saw those letters as his ticket to infamy.
So it wasn't just about confessing, it was about creating a persona.
Exactly. A brand of evil. And those smiley faces, they were like a sick joke.
A way to mock the authorities.
And the public's fascination with his crimes.
It all points back to that narcissism.
That inflated ego that needs attention.
Even negative attention. And then there's the impact on Jesperson's family, his daughter Melissa. Her book, Shattered Silence, really drove home the devastating ripple effects of his actions.
It's unimaginable to grow up with a seemingly normal father only to find out he's a monster.
And on top of that, she had to deal with the public scrutiny.
Right. The media attention, the whispers in her community, the constant reminders of her father's crimes.
It's a burden that no child should have to bear.
And yet, Melissa chose to share her story.
It's incredible. She turned her pain into a platform for understanding.
It's a testament to her resilience and her desire to break the cycle of silence.
By speaking out, she's challenging the stereotypes.
Humanizing the families of perpetrators.
Reminding us that they are victims too.
It's so important to remember that.
The impact of these crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims. It touches families, communities, and society as a whole.
It leaves us grappling with those uncomfortable questions.
About nature versus nurture, how someone we might consider ordinary can harbor such darkness.
It's a question that has haunted criminologists and psychologists for centuries.
And while we may never have a definitive answer, I do think these excerpts offer some valuable insights. The abuse in his childhood, the social isolation, the early signs of cruelty towards animals, these were all red flags.
They were warnings that something was seriously wrong.
And yet those red flags were missed.
Or ignored.
Which brings us to another question. Could these crimes have been prevented?
That's a tough question. But I think it's important to consider those missed opportunities.
The early intervention.
Again.
Providing support. Creating a society that doesn't shy away from addressing the root causes of violence.
It's a complex issue, but it's a conversation we need to have.
Absolutely. Well, as we move into the final part of our deep dive into the case of the Happy Face Killer, I think it's time to shift our focus to the present. How does his story continue to resonate today?
Well, you mentioned how his story continues to resonate, and it's true. I mean, there's a Paramount Plus series coming out starring Dennis Quaid. It's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. True crime continues to captivate us. Why do you think that is?
I think there's something about the dark side of human nature that just draws us in. We're trying to understand these horrific acts, trying to find a reason for the chaos.
I think you're right. And there's also this element of it could have been me.
Yeah.
We hear these stories and we think that could have been my neighbor, my coworker, someone I had passed on the street.
Someone you'd never suspect.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And it really forces us to confront the fact that evil doesn't always wear a mask.
Sometimes it hides in plain sight.
Like Jesperson, he was a seemingly ordinary guy. He had a job, relationships, even a family.
And yet underneath it all, he was capable of these horrific acts. It reminds us that we can't always judge a book by its cover.
Absolutely.
And it brings us back to the question of prevention. Knowing what we know about Jesperson's past, could those 8 murders have been prevented?
It's impossible to say for sure, but we have to consider those missed opportunities.
The early signs.
Right, the animal cruelty, the isolation, the troubled home life.
Those are all red flags.
And if they had been addressed, maybe things would have turned out differently.
So it's not just about recognizing the signs, it's about taking action.
Early intervention is key.
Providing support, creating a society that's not afraid to address the root causes of violence.
We need to foster empathy, understanding, open communication.
create safe spaces for people to come forward and ask for help.
Whether they're struggling themselves or concerned about someone else.
And, I think Melissa Moore's advocacy work is a perfect example of that.
She's taken her pain and turned it into something positive.
She's raising awareness, supporting families affected by violence,
Breaking the silence, challenging the stereotypes.
reminding us that the families of perpetrators, they carry a heavy burden too.
It's important to remember that.
And she's not alone. There are so many organizations and individuals dedicated to preventing violence. We'll be sure to include some resources in the show notes for anyone who wants to learn more.
That's a great idea.
These conversations, they don't end when the podcast is over.
We have a responsibility to keep learning, to keep raising awareness.
To keep working towards a world where stories like Jesperson's become less and less frequent.
It's a future worth fighting for.
Well said. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of the happy face killer, I'm left with this feeling of unease, but also hope.
We can't change the past.
But we can learn from it. We can use these stories to spark conversations, to challenge assumptions.
To work towards a future where violence isn't the answer.
Thank you for joining us on this journey. And we encourage you to keep exploring, to keep questioning, and to keep engaging in these important conversations. Until next time.